Some battles are not fought with fists or fury, but with silence, memory, and the resilience it takes to still belong even when others try to erase you. They thought I had disappeared, that I'd quietly accepted my place in the background. A relic of the past, a burden to be managed. But I'd simply stepped aside long enough to watch them expose themselves. Before we go any further, I have a question. Where are you watching from? Leave your city or state in the comments below. And if this story hits you in a place you've felt before, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. You won't want to miss this. Let me tell you what really happened. Not the version scribbled in freshly signed deed papers or whispered behind carefully closed doors. My name is Margaret Hale. I'm 67 years old. And this is how I learned that home isn't just about walls and windows. It's about history. And some histories fight back when you try to silence them. The first time I suspected something wasn't right, I was elbow deep in my garden, had just deadheaded the roses along the white fence my husband, Dennis, and I built before our 30th anniversary. I heard the gate creak behind me, the kind of groan that only old metal can make. I didn't turn, not at first. Not until I heard laughter. Polite, clipped, unfamiliar. She said she's just visiting family, a chipper woman's voice said. I looked up, pruning shears dangling at my wrist, and saw a man in a designer coat, leather folder under one arm, and shoes that definitely hadn't touched mulch. The realtor smiled at me like I was an extra in someone else's life. Oh, that's Margaret. Don't mind her, she's not staying long, not staying. I live here, I said. My voice didn't shake, but something inside me cracked. I watched them walk past me, into my house. The hardwood floors Dennis and I refinished together, the crown molding that still bore the tiny nick from when he dropped the hammer in 1982. They walked in like it was already theirs. That night, dinner was eerily quiet. My son, Ethan, barely lifted his eyes from his phone. His wife, Rachel, passed the salad bowl with a bright smile and said, "It was such a lovely day for gardening, wasn't it?" I looked at her hands, manicured. No soil beneath the nails, the kind of hands that sign things with ease. I wanted to scream. I wanted to slam my fist on the table and demand answers. But I didn't, because the betrayal already lived in the silence. Ethan had moved in with Rachel during a rough patch, or so they told me. Just until we saved for a place, they said. But suddenly, the mail had their names on it. My house had their furniture. And I had become invisible in my own life. That night, I opened my laptop for the first time in weeks. Searched, "Can you buy a house anonymously?" The engine lit up with links, each one a breadcrumb on a trail I never thought I'd follow. But I clicked and clicked again. Because while they'd started packing me out of my own home, they didn't know I'd started packing too. The house next door went up for sale the next day. I didn't hesitate. I didn't even blink. Richard Lennox, Dennis's old chess partner and a real estate lawyer, hadn't heard from me in over a year. But when I called, he answered on the second ring. "Margaret," he said, "you sound like a woman with unfinished business." And I was. With Richard's help, I created a trust. Silent, anonymous, invisible. The kind of buyer that sellers adore. And predators never see coming. The offer went through in less than 48 hours. Cash, fast, clean. The morning after the sale was finalized, Rachel buttered a bagel as if the world was normal. "Wonder what kind of people will move in next door," she said. "Hope they're quiet." I sipped my tea, held her gaze. "Let's hope so." She didn't notice the way my voice tightened around the words. She rarely noticed much these days, except when it benefited her. The first time I stepped into my new house just 10 steps beyond the hedge, I carried nothing but a canvas bag and quiet resolve. Inside smelled faintly of fresh paint and optimism. I opened every cabinet, every drawer. Not because I needed to store anything, but because I needed to see what wasn't there. Every absence was a relief. Every blank space was a promise. And just like that, I started watching. Not vindictively, but carefully. They thought I'd vanished, that I was out, away, done, perfect. Let them believe it. I watched Rachel haul decorative pillows onto my sofa. I watched Ethan wrestle with the box that had once held my holiday wreaths. I said nothing, but in that silence I prepared. I made lists of what went missing, not valuables, necessarily just meaningfuls. My mother's brooch, the chipped blue lamp from the guest room, it's my wedding album, which I found later. In their garage, they were erasing me, so I left reminders, sticky notes at first, tucked inside drawers, behind bathroom mirrors, under Ethan's old baseball cap that still sat on the closet shelf. This wasn't yours to take. This light stayed on until you came home. Little ghosts of ink and memory daring to confront the theft wrapped in courtesy. No yelling, no confrontation. It's just quiet truth and ink. This is when you stop and realize this story isn't just about me. It's also maybe about you. Because if you've ever felt like they tried to write you out of your own story, I hope you'll stay with me through this one. And if you believe that no one, no child, no spouse, no signature has the right to erase your worth, click subscribe. Share this story. Someone needs to hear it. And now, if you're ready, let's begin. No one ever imagines their child will become a stranger. You see them fall asleep in your arms. You feed them when their mouths are too small for anything but tiny spoons and lullabies. And then one day you're standing in the hallway of your own home listening as they whisper behind closed doors. Planning the extraction of your life? It wasn't just stories being boxed up in that house. It was me. Weeks passed. Rachel painted the kitchen a sterile gray and took down the handmade ceramic clock Dennis had gifted me on our 25th anniversary. When I asked where it went, she smiled and said, "We're going for a more modern vibe." Modern. That was the word they used over and over. Like I was an antique that didn't quite match the decor anymore. Ethan, my own son, seemed to have withered into the version of himself she preferred. His voice was lower around me now, tight, efficient, like my presence required patience. I watched through the blinds of my new house as he brought in movers, replacing furniture that held stories with pieces that held none. And all the while, I kept collecting dot photos of my belongings, stuffed in garage bins with donation stickers, receipts left behind for junk removal services. That's what they labeled it. Junk. My life wasn't just being abandoned. It was being made disposable. At night, I'd sit by the window, cradling a mug I'd kept hidden. A faded ceramic with tiny daisies on it, one of the last hand-thrown cups Dennis made in his pottery days. I'd run my thumb across the crackled glaze and wonder, how many women lose everything step by step while being told it's happening for their own good? Richard started coming by twice a week, not always as my lawyer, sometimes just as an old friend who could sense that I needed not to be alone. "You're doing all this quietly," he said. "Any part of you want to confront it head on?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I handed him a photo I'd printed from my security camera. Rachel was tossing a box labeled Margaret's papers into a garbage bin. "This isn't about rage," I said. "It's about recognition. There's a peculiar grief in realizing you've been useful more than you've been loved. I wasn't just mourning the house. I was mourning every birthday dinner when I paid the bill, pretending not to notice the lack of effort. Every holiday where they arrived late and left early. Every hug Ethan gave me with one arm. Holding his phone in the other, I made peace with the fact that I wasn't what they wanted. But I would not allow them to strip me from my own legacy. Richard and I pulled the paperwork from the firm that handled the mortgage refinance after Dennis passed. And there it was, a single paragraph aged and legally forgotten by everyone. But the paper it was printed on, Clause 14B, no modification, transfer, or sale shall be executed without written consent of both named parties, so long as either is living and of sound mind. Dennis had added it because he'd seen families torn apart to Isley after his father's house had been sold without consulting his mother. He'd sworn that would never happen to us. It didn't, Not legally, because, with that single clause, I had something more powerful than anger. I had authority. The next afternoon, I walked down the cul-de-sac with the confidence of a woman who had finally remembered who she was. The flaming red maple leaves crunched beneath my shoes, and I could almost hear Dennis's voice. We plant roots, Margaret, not so we stay stuck, but so we always know where we're from. I didn't knock when I entered the house. I used my key, the one Rachel hadn't asked me to return, probably thinking I'd never be bold enough to use it again. Surprise flickered in Rachel's eyes as I stepped into the now gray kitchen. I just need a few things, I said. From what's left of me in this place, she blinked. Of course, but Tui already moved most of your stuff into the attic. Did you move clause 1 for B2? I asked, calm, controlled, a few papers in my hand. I placed them gently on the granite countertop she'd recently installed, replacing the butcher block. Dennis and I had sealed together one spring Saturday. What is that? Ethan asked, walking in from the den. Your father's last promise to me, I replied. Ethan read the page slowly. I watched the color wash from his face. You never mentioned this, he muttered. No, I said, 'cause I never thought I'd need it. There was a pause, heavy, thick with implications neither of them wanted to face. Are you going to sue us? Rachel asked, her voice high and tight. I shook my head. No, I'm going to unravel what you tried to quietly destroy. And then I left, back in my new home where the warmth had started to resemble something close to peace. I opened an old journal, wrote down everything I had now. Legal leverage proof of personal property removed without consent chain of verbal manipulations, and most important, witnesses, not just Richard, but the neighbors, old friends, even their own words. Truth has a way of fermenting. The longer it sits, the more potent it becomes. I wasn't just rebuilding. I was becoming undeniable. I'd like to say that it didn't hurt, that all of this was just strategy and grit. But I missed my son every night. To walk past the photo of him at age 10, front teeth missing, smile crooked, freckles across his nose. A little boy who loved Legos and strawberry milk and always wanted one more bedtime story? Where had he gone? Did Rachel swallow him whole? Or had I misread who he was all this time? I didn't know, but I knew this. I could mourn the boy I lost without tolerating the man he had become. And that was the real shift. Quietly, without revenge, without shouting ... I found power in choosing myself again. Some women wait a lifetime for someone to choose them. Others stop waiting and choose themselves. Every morning felt quieter now. Not lonely exactly, just less polluted with the weight deceptions bring. In my new kitchen, I let the radio play old jazz standards, the kind Dennis used to hum while flipping pancakes. I brewed coffee without rushing. I arranged wildflowers in mismatched jars because I could. It was simple, free from their timeline. And God, it was honest. From my living room window, I'd sometimes catch glimpses of Rachel pacing the yard. She was always holding her phone close to her ear, talking in that clipped voice of hers, the one she used when things weren't going her way. But she couldn't risk looking desperate. She knew. And she didn't know what to do about it. Because I hadn't filed anything, I hadn't demanded repayment, hadn't announced their betrayal publicly. I'd simply held the truth in my hands and waited. That was the worst kind of threat for someone like her. At church, whispers followed me. Not in scorn, but curiosity. I've heard I'd moved. Others thought I'd been relocated by Ethan and Rachel for health reasons. I let the rumors spread like ivy. Because as long as people talked without knowing, still controlled the narrative. Richard called one afternoon. Thought you might be interested in this, he said. You're not going to believe who requested a showing at your old house. Paused. You're kidding. He, WASN, single quotes to ... 3 different potential buyers had withdrawn interest in less than 2 weeks. All shook by what Rachel described privately as logistical delays and surprise legal complications. Code 4. Margaret isn't going quietly. Rachel and Ethan had tried remodeling, tried staging, even tried rebranding the home as a modernized classic. But something lingered beneath the designer paint and duplicate smiles they wore during open houses. You can't scrub out history, and certainly not when the person who built it is watching from 50 feet away. Sometimes I wondered how long they thought I'd accept things. Was there ever a bedtime story where the mother is evicted in silence and just fades into the background? Or had they simply convinced themselves they were helping me? That was the part that stung hardest, the pretending this wasn't theft. Pretending it was logistics. Pretending it was done out of love. Love doesn't ask you to disappear before the story ends. Love doesn't shrink you into collateral damage. One morning I went back. It's the garden. Not mine anymore. Not legally. But roots don't care about deeds. I stood by the rose bushes, brown and brittle now, neglected. Water starved. Funny, isn't it? How quickly beauty dies when it's detached from tenderness. I stroked one of the branches, careful not to draw blood from the thorns. One petal clung to a blossom like it didn't know it was already gone. I knew that feeling. Behind me I heard Ethan's voice. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I didn't turn around. "Neither should this garden look like this." He exhaled sharply. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I haven't even started yet," I replied. Quietly, it was the first real conversation we'd had in months. But it didn't feel like talking to family. It felt like talking to someone who wasn't used to facing the aftermath of his own choices. "I miss how things used to be," he said, softer now. "You miss when I stayed quiet." I corrected. "There's a difference." He didn't deny it, just stood there breathing like he had something else to say, but ran out of courage before the words reached his lips. There was no shouting, no slaps, no dramatic declarations, just the painful realization of a son seeing, for the first time, that his mother bled too. I returned to my small new kitchen and placed a cup of tea on the windowsill. This was chamomile, the one I used to offer Ethan when he had nightmares. It's funny how life places echoes in your hands and asks if you still remember their meaning. I looked around the room and realized this didn't look like my old life, but it felt like me. It had pieces of my real identity, not the one sacrificed to Rachel's aesthetics or Ethan's vision of control, but the woman I'd left behind while playing their version of mother, and every day I brought more of her back. I enrolled in a watercolor class at the senior center. It's the first artistic hobby I'd picked up since Dennis passed. I started saying no, even to polite invitations that didn't feed my spirit. And maybe the bravest thing, I forgave myself for staying quiet when I should have shouted, for dimming my light so theirs would shine, for believing motherhood meant martyrdom. It doesn't. Then came the letter, a typed memo, hand-delivered from Rachel. I could smell the expensive perfume on the page before I even unfolded it. Brief, businesslike, requesting a formal meeting, peaceful resolution, starting over. I laughed, not out of cruelty, but because the manipulation had finally become obvious even to them. They weren't inviting me back. They were trying to pause the consequences, but they couldn't. Not anymore. Inside me, something had unlocked. Not cruelty, not revenge, something quieter, stronger. I would no longer participate in their performance. The next morning, I returned. The letter in a blue envelope, the color of the guest bedroom walls they'd painted over without asking. Inside, I wrote 5 words. "You already told my story." And underneath it, I taped a copy of Clause 14b. No signature, no threats, just truth.solid. Legal UNMOVABL. And perhaps for the first time in months, I smiled. People often underestimate the sound of emptiness. But when the phone doesn't ring, when the apology doesn't come, when the silence echoes louder than any insult ever could, that's when the truth finally lands. They didn't respond to the envelope. No calls. No messages. For the next few days, even Rachel's usual noise seemed to fade. The blinds stayed drawn more often. The showings stopped. The house, my old house, stood still. It was the kind of stillness that feels like shame, and I let it sit. When people betray us, they assume forgiveness is an obligation. That age softens us. That time makes us forget. But age doesn't soften. It sharpens. It clarifies. It makes you know exactly what was taken and what can never be handed back. I wasn't going to waste more decades wishing they had been kinder with my years, so I built a new morning ritual: coffee, warm slippers, my journal, and a list. Not a list of what they owed me, but of what I remembered, the way. Dennis would place his hand on the back of my neck when I was anxious. The smell of rain on the porch steps before summer finally cracked open. How I felt walking barefoot across the wood floors after waxing them myself one spring morning, proud, powerful, still in love. My memories didn't belong to the walls. They belonged to me. They could steal the frame, but the photographs still lived where they couldn't reach. One morning, stood in my tiny backyard and planted hydrangeas, my favorite flower. Dennis once told me they were resilient. They changed color based on the pH of the soil, adapting, evolving, bending to survive, but still beautiful. Just like you'll have to be when I'm gone, it said. With those eyes that always knew things before I did, I placed them near the back fence, close enough where they'd be visible from Ethan and Rachel's side. I wasn't taunting. I was reclaiming beauty. And every time Rachel watered her factory-grown roses, she'd have to look at mine, wild, real, and growing. The transformative silence didn't last. One evening, Ethan appeared at my door. No call, no warning. Just a knock and the awkward shift of weight that signaled guilt before he even spoke a word. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. I didn't say yes. I just stepped aside. He sat at my table, the one Dennis built before he got sick, ran his hand across the wood grain absent-mindedly, like it could take him back to a time he no longer knew how to find. "I didn't think it would go this far," he said. "You mean you didn't think I'd stand up?" I corrected. Calm. Not bitter, just done pretending. His voice cracked. "She said it would be easier this way, that she knew what was best for you. And what did you believe?" I asked. He looked up at me then. I believed her honesty. Finally, and in that moment I realized something important. Honesty can come too late to fix what's broken. "I kept expecting you to understand," he confessed. "To support us, you always supported everything." "Yes," I said, until I realized support shouldn't come at the cost of disappearing. There it was, the crux of everything. He didn't see what he did as betrayal. He saw it as a transaction, one where he assumed I'd surrender gracefully, like I was a backup character in his life. But I'd played the lead in my story for too long to be written out now. He asked if I wanted to move back. I nearly laughed. But I did instead. And what would that look like? Me in your guest room, under curfews, surrounded by design choices that erase every memory I ever loved. He didn't answer, because he knew you can't ask someone to return to what you burned down. After he left, I sat with Richard. We had tea in the garden, surrounded by unfinished rose beds, packs of unopened seeds, and mile-long to-do lists that now brought me joy instead of exhaustion. He asked me to come back, I told him. Richard sipped, squinting at the last light of day, kissing the pine fence. "Are you going to?" "No," I said, my voice steady, because the real me never left. He smiled at that, not the kind of grin born from victory, but from recognition. He'd seen this woman before, years ago, before this slow fade of caretaking, sacrifices, adaptations in the name of family. The Margaret who wore quiet power like armor, who didn't apologize for existing. This was her house now, not because of walls, but because of boundaries, because she'd returned to herself. One final thing remained. I pulled out a wooden box I hadn't opened in years. Inside, letters. From Dennis, scribbled napkin notes, anniversary cards, one full journal he'd written to me during his chemo sessions. I read them all, cover to cover. Let the pain mix with the love. Let the tears come, cleansing not just grief, but the guilt of having survived longer than the one who made me feel most seen. Then I took one letter, the last one, and walked next door one final time. No, one answered the door. So I left it in the mailbox. 3 simple lines. May this house remind you of what you've done, what you destroyed, and what you'll never get back. No signature. No name, just truth. Typed, folded, delivered. I didn't need revenge. I just needed to be remembered correctly. Not every victory makes noise. Some are won in silence, in stillness, in staring at the life they tried to take from you. Hey, and smiling because it never left your soul. Weeks passed with a strange quiet, not empty, full. The kind of fullness that didn't need explanations or apologies. Margaret had planted herself again, roots deeper, quieter, but unshakable. The house next door, her old house, went on the market again, this time with a price cut and tall tales about complications. With the previous owners, truth has a scent. And buyers were starting to smell the lies. One realtor called Richard to ask about the angry old woman next door who keeps interfering. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. No, he replied, that's the former owner. And what you're calling interference is actually what we call justice. They stopped calling after that. Inside her new home, Margaret began building something unexpected, a legacy, not through wealth or possessions, but through story. She contacted a local journalism student at the community college, Naomi, a 22-year-old intern who had once asked her after church, she always took 2 sugar cubes in her tea. I grew up in the South, Margaret said back then. You don't ever forget your sweetness, even if life tries to boil it out of you. That one line made Naomi smile and led her to pitch a profile piece on Margaret to her professor. Now Margaret sat across from her, sipping tea again. Tell me everything, Naomi said. Wide-eyed, notepad ready, and she did. Not for revenge, not for pity, but for record so the world would know what happened to women like her. Quiet warriors overlooked between headlines and hashtags. Women whose lives were stolen in pieces, not all at once. Women who survived because they remembered who they were when no one else did. Rachel eventually moved out. Margaret watched her through the kitchen blinds. Same white SUV, same overpacked trunk. But something about the way she carried her purse, tense, rushed, brittle, spoke volumes. There was no goodbye, no apology, only absence. Good. Let it echo. Let her remember the garden she let die. Stories she erased. And the dignity of the woman still standing just 10 steps away, unbroken. Ethan wrote a letter, just 4 pages. Handwritten, messy, clearly started and restarted more than once. It wasn't a plea. And it wasn't quite an apology either. It was, human. He wrote about how he never realized how much Margaret had held together. That he thought caring for her meant taking over, not listening. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, but hoped she knew he finally understood the cost. Margaret folded the letter carefully, as if handling the last breath of an old song. She didn't respond. Not yet. Some bridges aren't burned. They're just no longer walked across, with no one watching her timeline anymore. Agreed. Unapologetically bloomed. The watercolor class became her therapy. Her bedroom, now decorated in deep ambers and ocean blues, held her laughter. Voice grew stronger when she walked into the market, when she spoke at the community center book club. When she called her own name on the volunteer schedule, no longer just Mom or Mrs. or someone's guest, just Margaret. Fully. One day, Naomi emailed the final story draft. Its title, Reclaimed, The Woman Who Bought Back Her Voice. Margaret cried for 37 minutes after reading it, not in grief, in recognition. That article would be printed in the local column next Sunday. And maybe if someone else, some woman with her own bruises, her own erased history, saw it and remembered her power, It would all be worth it. Lying in bed under a thick knitted cover, Margaret reached for the lamp Dennis once fixed. When the wire sparked years ago, her hand lingered over the little dent in its base. He would have been proud, not for the fight, but for the way she chose silence over spite. Power over pity outside. A breeze shook the wind chime she'd hung 3 weeks after the truth came out. Its sound didn't haunt. It healed. Each note a reminder. You stayed. You rose. You remembered. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need reconciliation. She needed peace. And now she had it. There comes a day long after the pain grows quiet and the echoes stop begging to be heard, when you realize they don't get to write your ending. You do. That morning, the sun rose in soft gold, tracing ribbons of light across Margaret's new kitchen. She stood with her hands around a warm mug, watching as the clouds scattered like pieces falling gently into place. There was no noise, no tension, just breath. She didn't think about Rachel anymore. Not with anger. Not even with sadness. Rachel had been a storm, yes. But even storms lose power once they pass. Ethan had sent one more letter. This time, shorter. Just 2 lines. If you want me to walk through any of this with you, just tell me where to. Start. I'm not asking you to forget. Just let me help plant something new. Margaret placed the note inside her journal, not as a promise, but as a maybe. Some things take time. Some roots take longer to trust the soil again. She wasn't interested in rebuilding the past, but if he truly wanted to grow, he'd have to get his hands dirty at her pace. Okay? In her time, spring arrived like wet laughter. Loud in places, soft in others, but undeniable. The garden bloomed. Hydrangeas, roses, lilies, scattered like pieces of Margaret's heart-finding. They're way back into sunlight. Naomi's article was published in the Sunday paper. It's just under the community stories where hope lives in black and white columns. Margaret's mailbox overflowed by midweek letters from other women, strangers, some as old as her, some much younger, all of them writing the same thing. I didn't know anyone else went through this. Your story made me feel less crazy. You reminded me I'm still allowed to fight. She read every one, some twice. It didn't matter that none of them knew her beyond ink on a page. They saw her, really saw her, not as a burden, not as a relic, but as a mirror where their own strength waited to be remembered. At the senior center, her watercolor was hung in the main hallway. A landscape of her former home's backyard, whole again, okay? Only this time with brighter grass and a sky tinged with lavender. Below it, a quote handwritten in brushstroke ink. No one uproots a woman who knows where she's been. They asked if she'd teach a beginner's class. She said yes, to give, not to prove. To pass the brush to someone else just beginning to whisper, maybe I'm worth painting again. Richard came with a pair of antique wind chimes one afternoon. They're from your original porch, he grinned. Found them at a flea market 20 miles out. She laughed and helped him hang them in the tree just outside her bedroom window. That night, the breeze returned, uninvited but soft. A visitor from another page in her life. The chimes danced, and so did something in her chest, peace. Maybe, possibly, pride? One last memory remained. The wedding album, she hadn't asked for it back. She'd seen it once, tucked behind boxes on the floor of her former garage, vulnerable, dusty, unprotected. It didn't feel right to take it back just because it was hers by law. So instead, she made a new one. Photos of her garden, of the hydrangeas in bloom, Naomi holding up the article and pretending to be famous, of herself gray hair, messy, eyes alive, with dirt under her nails and a grin that finally didn't apologize for taking up space. On the last page, she pasted a note. This is what healing looks like. Not perfect, not fast, but mine. They tried to erase her, but Margaret Hale didn't ask permission to stay bold. She stayed. In her truth, in her silence, in her voice. And though it took losing everything, she finally found herself again. If you've ever felt invisible, If someone made you believe you had no right to hold space in your own story, please remember this: you are not lost. You're waiting to be found by yourself, and when you decide, not them, when that time comes. I hope, like Margaret, you come home to the most important place of all, inside yourself. And if you're still here, listening to this story, I ask only one thing. Share this with someone who needs to believe it's not too late. Click like if Margaret's story made you feel something real. Subscribe if you're ready to hear more stories where women refuse to be erased, and where healing comes without apology. Every view helps us share stories like this with people who need them most. The world doesn't need louder voices. It needs truer ones. Thank you for letting Margaret speak. She's not finished yet. None of us are.